Good day. Before I proceed, I have a few announcements to make. The first is that if anybody wishes to go to our channel on YouTube, they will find that we have taken down all our recent live streams in which we have covered the situation in Ukraine, and that we are not broadcasting on YouTube for the moment. Secondly, another factor in making our decision was that one particular Russian broadcaster repackaged some information, some comments made by Gonzalo Lira, our friend and fellow commentator who has been in Kiev and is in Ukraine, and who has provided on-the-spot information about the situation in Ukraine. This Russian broadcaster took the information that Gonzalo Lira provided without his permission or his knowledge, and repackaged it and edited it and republished it without his knowledge and outside its correct context. This is, in my opinion, deeply unethical, indeed disgraceful behavior, and it has put Gonzalo in a very serious position in Ukraine itself. So we want to make it clear at the DURAN that we are utterly opposed to this misinformation or information abuse from whichever side it comes. We consider it completely wrong and inappropriate, and for that reason we have decided that we're not going to use YouTube for the moment, because of course it is to YouTube that people can come see our information most easily, and as I said, misrepresent and change it. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing I wanted to say briefly is that, of course, if you're following us through Rumble, you can find us on Rumble by typing in our various the details of our various channels in the search bar. If you go to Rumble, if you watch our videos on Rumble and press the red maroon button you will see at the top of the video, that will take you directly to our locals platform, where there are many programs, where you will find much exclusive content that we don't publish anywhere else, and where you can join our community. So that's what I wanted to say about those things. Now, for the moment at least, I've decided that to maintain regular updates on this channel. I want to make it clear that these are my opinions only, and that if anybody out there wants to make use of my opinions, well, I will not take it well if what was done to Gonzalo Lira and to us on YouTube, the DURAN on YouTube, is done to me. So I want to make that very clear. You want to know what I think? Go to the original source, my own broadcasts, and don't run away and think that anything of mine taken out of context by third parties necessarily, or in fact in any way, represents my opinions. Now, what I'm going to cover today, obviously, is the situation in Ukraine, and it seems to me that we are now in a three-part struggle. We have a military conflict in Ukraine itself, about which I'm going to say a little. I'm not, as I've said many times, a military person. We have a financial war, which is not going, I think, quite in the way that the Western powers had anticipated. I think they're discovering that the Russians are much more organized and much more resilient than they had expected. And I think that that is making some of them extremely angry. And it's resulted in some extremely unfortunate comments by the French finance minister and by some British officials about the West waging economic war on Russia, which I think they have tried to backtrack from. But there it is. They took the extraordinary steps over the weekend, apparently disregarding the advice of the technical experts in the banking world, including in their own central banks, that disconnecting key Russian banks from SWIFT and sanctioning a G20 central bank would be a dangerous thing to do to the entire financial system. And the result is that we are in an economic war with unpredictable consequences. I should say that just before starting this program, I had a conversation with somebody I know in the financial world, somebody who is extremely well informed, and he has told me that the massive concern now is that because of the disconnection from SWIFT, there will be a cascade of defaults going through the system, and that these have considerable potential to do very grave damage to the global financial system, and that this fact does not appear to have been understood. I should add that I also get the impression that some people in Germany, some of the officials in the German government have had what you might call a morning after the night before moment. They're starting to ask themselves, what exactly did we do over the weekend? Why did we take this extraordinary step that we had previously said we wouldn't take? And that they're now trying to limit the damage by trying to limit the number of banks, the Russian banks, that are going to be disconnected from SWIFT. And they're also trying to carve out exemptions and exceptions and all those sort of things in a way which I suspect is going to prove extremely difficult. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that in this program, except for one final thing, which is that the anticipated collapse in the ruble has not really happened. There's obviously been a significant depreciation, but I don't think that this is a matter that in and of itself is a huge concern to the Russian government. And my own impression is that the Russian government is rapidly taking steps, and the Russian central bank, to shore up the position of the ruble-based financial system within Russia. And I strongly expect that we're going to see a whole system of capital controls, and with Russia moving rapidly towards a controlled economy, disconnected maybe from the world financial system, but operating in a controlled way, which I think it is well within Russia's capacity to do. I read an article, I just mentioned this in passing, comparing the effect of sanctions on Iran with sanctions on Russia, the sanctions on each country being very similar. And the article pointed out that, contrary to Western expectations, contrary to US expectations, the sanctions imposed on Iran did not cause the Iranian economy to completely collapse, and that the Russian economy, which has some similarities to the Iranian, according to this article, in terms of its structure, but obviously operates on a much bigger scale and is considerably more sophisticated, is unlikely to experience any sort of collapse, and that anybody who is expecting that or anticipating it is going to be disappointed. I also read an article by Jeremy Warner in the Daily Telegraph, which essentially said the same thing. So that's all I'm going to say about the economics. About the military matters, I'm going to say a little more, though not very much, because as I have said on many occasions, I am not a military person. What I want to say is this, what I want to reiterate again, is that the major conflict, the major fighting is not taking place where the Western media is focused, in Kiev and Kharkiv. It is taking place in the Donbass, in that part of eastern Ukraine, where the Russians and their allies in the militia of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are now steadily tightening their noose around the Ukrainian forces, or so it seems to me. And my own understanding is that the Russian and militia advances in this part of the world are actually quite rapid, and that a significant force of 12 to 18 brigades, I think I've got the military unit designation correct, of the Ukrainian military are now at serious danger of total encirclement. And it seems that the important center of Mariupol, where there's a large concentration of Ukrainian troops, some of them drawn from ultra-nationalist battalions, is now essentially surrounded, and that Ukraine has now lost all control of all the shores of the Sea of Azov, apart from Mariupol itself. So that, as far as I understand, is what is going on in eastern Ukraine. But it's something else that I'm going to want to talk about, because discussions took place in Belarus over the weekend between the Russians, between the Russians and the Ukrainians. There's supposed to be another meeting tomorrow. The very fact that these negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians in Belarus are taking place is indicative of two things. Firstly, the Ukrainians have been forced to negotiate something which up to now they've been very resistant about doing. And secondly, the negotiations, the very fact that the negotiations are going on, argues strongly against any immediate Russian plan to storm Kiev. This is something which I think a lot of people in the West have been speculating about. There's been lots of discussion. The fact that the Russians haven't stormed Kiev or even Kharkiv has been put down to the courage and resistance of the Ukrainian military. But the Russians have said pretty much from the outset of this campaign, and this is what they have said. I'm not making observations. It's what they've been saying from the outset, that they were not going to attack civilian infrastructure, and that they weren't going to attack residents and storm cities, that this was an operation intended to demilitarize Ukraine and to deal with the far-right organizations which have wielded so much influence within Ukraine. And if the Russians want to continue a negotiation with the Ukrainians, which will achieve those objectives, then that argues against any immediate plan to storm Kiev. Because, of course, if they storm Kiev, the government, the Ukrainian government, which is still apparently located in Kiev, it refused pressure from the United States to evacuate Lvov. If Kiev falls and the Ukrainian government falls, then negotiations of that nature become impossible. And there is another and very important twist to this, because, as I said recently, the Chinese government appears to be positioning itself as a potential mediator in these discussions. And the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, has had two extremely important telephone conversations with two officials, German Foreign Minister Baerbock on the 26th of February, that was on Friday, and also he's now spoken over the phone to the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba. And in it, Wang Yi has explained China's position very clearly and given a clear insight of where a mediation exercise sponsored by China, what its potential outcome would be. I'm going to deal briefly with the comments, with the readouts that the Chinese have provided of both of these calls. So I'm going to start first with the conversation with Baerbock, which took place on Friday. And the Chinese readout reads as follows. Wang Yi said China pays close attention to the evolving situation in Ukraine and supports all efforts conducive to easing the situation and political settlement with regard to European security issues. All countries' legitimate concerns should be taken seriously. In the context of NATO's 5 consecutive rounds of eastward expansion, Russia's legitimate security demands ought to be properly addressed. Wang Yi said the Cold War has long gone and it's necessary for NATO to reconsider its positioning and responsibilities. China believes that the Cold War mentality based on bloc confrontation should be completely discarded. China supports NATO, the EU and Russia in resuming dialogue aimed at building a balanced, effective and sustained European security mechanism so as to achieve lasting peace and stability on the European continent. Wang Yi said China disapproves of the use of sanctions to solve problems, still less unilateral sanctions that have no basis in international law. It has long been proved that sanctions, far from being a solution, will only create new problems. Sanctions will not only cause a lose-lose or all-lose situation in economy, but also disrupt or impact on the political settlement process. Wang Yi said that as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China has always fulfilled its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. We believe that should the Security Council take action, it should contribute to a political settlement of the current crisis rather than instigate new antagonism and confrontation. In view of this, when the Security Council discussed the resolution related to the Ukraine issue, China prevented quoting expressions that contained the authorization of the use of force and sanctions. China will continue to play a constructive role in seeking and realizing peace. Now, the point about China prevented quoting expressions that contain the authorization of the use of force and sanctions shows that China told the Western powers that if the Western powers proposed any veto that threatened sanctions against Russia under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, then China would veto that resolution. In the event no such wording appears, apparently, in the draft resolution put forward, so China simply abstained. But in all other respects, you can see that Wang Yi here is making it very clear that the problem, as far as he sees it, the event which has created the crisis between Russia and Ukraine is NATO expansion. He says, with regard to European security issues, all countries' legitimate concerns should be taken seriously. In the context of NATO's 5 consecutive rounds of eastward expansion, Russia's legitimate security demands ought to be properly addressed. And Wang Yi said the Cold War has long gone and it's necessary for NATO to reconsider its positioning and responsibilities. Now, hold on to that, and we will come to that in a moment when we look at what Wang Yi said to the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba. But note that he's criticizing NATO eastward expansion, and he says that NATO, the EU, and Russia should resume dialogue and build a balanced, effective, and sustained European security mechanism so as to achieve lasting peace and stability on the European continent. I would first observe, before I go into this in more detail, that this very closely mirrors, in fact, it is essentially identical to the Russian position. But going further with the beer bock conversation, note that Wang Yi also said very clearly that China disapproves of Western sanctions. It regards unilateral sanctions as contrary to international law and sees the sanctions that the West has imposed as on Russia as unhelpful and as having instigated and intensified the conflict. So that's Wang Yi's rather schoolmasterly response to Baerbock, basically telling her, you've created this problem, you in the West have created this problem, you've gone on expanding NATO, that is what is behind this crisis, you've got to stop expanding NATO, you've got to sit down with the Russians and agree peace with them, understanding that they have legitimate security interests. So that's Wang Yi's comments to Baerbock. But Wang Yi's comments to Kuleba are in some way equally interesting. Now, Kuleba and Wang Yi spoke today, 1st March, and it's important to note that it was Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, who called Wang Yi. And the conversation, the Chinese readout reads as follows. Kuleba briefed Wang Yi on the outcomes of the first round of negotiation between Ukraine and Russia, noting that ending the war is the top priority for Ukraine. He said Ukraine is open to solving the current issue through negotiation and approaches the negotiation with positivity and sincerity. The word sincerity is important because up to now, when it comes to negotiating the Minsk agreement, Ukraine has not been willing to negotiate the Minsk to fulfill the terms of the Minsk agreement. So this might suggest that Ukraine might be shifting its position. Kuleba noted that although the negotiation was not smooth, the Ukrainian side still maintains calm and is willing to move forward with the talks. He said China has played a constructive role on this issue and that Ukraine is ready to step up communication with the Chinese side. He looked forward to China's mediation efforts for the ceasefire. Now, that confirms that the Chinese have been actively engaged in the diplomacy, that they are much more actively engaged than the Western media is reporting, or indeed any media is reporting, that the Chinese have been talking to the Russians and they've been talking to the Ukrainians. And note the words, Kuleba looked forward to China's mediation efforts. So the Ukrainians have in effect agreed to Chinese mediation. Then the readout goes on. Wang Yi said, the situation in Ukraine has changed rapidly and dramatically. China is deeply grieved to see the conflict between Ukraine and Russia and highly concerned about the damage done to civilians. China's fundamental position on the Ukraine issue is open, transparent, and consistent. We have always advocated respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries. On the current crisis, China calls on Ukraine and Russia to find a solution through negotiations and supports all constructive international efforts that are conducive to a political settlement. Wang Yi stressed that China has always believed that the security of one country should not be achieved at the expense of the security of other countries, and that regional security cannot be achieved by expanding military blocs. To address the expanding warfare, The pressing task for now is to alleviate the situation on the ground as much as possible, to avoid the escalation of conflicts or even the loss of control. Harms done to civilians and humanitarian crises in particular must be prevented, and the safe and timely access of humanitarian assistance should be ensured. Now, then the rest of the readout is about Ukraine's assistance in getting Chinese citizens caught up in the conflict out of Ukraine. So note, firstly, the point again that China is engaging in some kind of mediation exercise. But note also the critical sentence. Wang Yi stressed that China has always believed that the security of one country should not be achieved at the expense of the security of other countries, and that regional security cannot be achieved by expanding military blocs. So he told Baerbock on Friday that it is a mistake. It has been a cardinal mistake to expand NATO eastward, and he's told Kuleba today, Tuesday, that eastward expansion, that Ukraine entering NATO is the heart of the problem. Regional security cannot be achieved by expanding military blocs. So that tells us the outlines of China's mediation concept. An end to the war, some kind of arrangement that preserves Ukraine's territorial integrity, by which I think that means Ukraine minus Crimea, but perhaps finding some way round the Russian recognition of the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, but a commitment from Ukraine that it will not join NATO. In other words, an end to NATO's eastward expansion, thus resolving Russia's legitimate security concerns. And that seems to be the Chinese position. That seems to be what Chinese diplomacy is working towards. And the Ukrainians seem to be receptive. And of course, given there's a mediation exercise underway, I suspect that the Russians are too. And I'm going to make a further suggestion. This is just a guess. It may be wrong, and I'm not insisting on it. But I wonder whether this has been what has been going on all along, whether the reason why the Russian military campaign has avoided attacking civilian infrastructure, has not sought to storm Kiev or Kharkiv. In the case of Kiev, there's no doubt at all in my mind that the Russians are fully in a position to do it, that the reason all that is happening is because the purpose of this whole operation is not to conquer Ukraine, but to get Ukraine to come to the table and to agree to what is in effect the Minsk agreement, or in some form, and to commit also some binding, in some kind of legally binding form, to drop Ukraine's quest for membership of NATO. If that's the case, then I can see how that could actually end the war if the Ukrainians agree. And of course, presumably from a Russian point of view, part of that agreement would be what the defanging of what the Russians object to, which is these extreme right groupings that exist within Ukraine. Now, if a deal like on these lines is done, if the Chinese broker a deal like this between the Ukrainians and the Russians, bringing the Ukrainian conflict to an end, then I'm going to make a number of observations. Firstly, the United States is not going to be happy, having been in effect sidelined in negotiations over the future of Ukraine. Secondly, it will obviously expand Chinese influence into Western Eurasia. Thirdly, it's difficult to see how the European Union could object, and that might be very embarrassing for some people in the European Union who have taken some, I think, rather unwise rhetorical positions. But fourthly, again, I come back to my previous guess, and it's only a guess. I do wonder whether this has been coordinated between the Russians and the Chinese all along. Whether the idea was that the Western powers were clearly not honest brokers between Russia, or rather, to be more precise, between the Ukrainians and the representatives of the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, that the Western powers were not honest brokers in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia over NATO membership, that they were leading Ukraine up the garden path, and that Ukraine, for its part, because it had this Western backing, so no particular need to shift from these positions. But bringing a Russian army